Hi, we continue today at the end of Genesis 4 and the beginning of Genesis 5 in a transitional section where for the first time in the plot we're seeing repetition. We're seeing that after the beginning of creation, when God had the unique actions of making heaven and earth, and then the unique actions in chapter 2 of creating the first human beings, now human beings are creating more human beings after the failed first pair of Cain and Abel, as we've seen in the last couple of chapters. So not only in the plot is there repetition in the beginning of a pattern, and we'll see that next time as we explore the genealogy in the rest of chapter 5 that follows the section we're looking at today, but also in terms of the two authors that we understand to be behind Genesis, the priestly author known as P and the Yahwist author known as J. In the older understanding, J was a much earlier authorship from the time of Solomon in the 10th century BCE, and P from the time of Babylonian exile in the 6th century. But as I've been indicating throughout, and I'll continue throughout the primeval history to suggest, more recent understandings would see the Yahwist author as also exilic, especially because of the many references to Babylon or exile or elements of that Babylonian exilic context that we're going to see in the story. And here is another example of that they're more likely at the same time, or even the Yahwist being a little later. We'll look at that in more detail, but just to set the frame, I invite you to look at the text on the left side of the screen, which is all we're going to cover today from 425 to 5:5. And so you see in 425, it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. But then if you look down in a few verses in 5:3, we see when Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth. Well, which is it? Did she name him Seth, or did he name him Seth? And what we'll see is that 425 is almost certainly a Yahwist text, despite the fact that it uses the word Elohim for God, and 5:3, really starting in 5:1, is a priestly text. So we'll see how that plays out, offering two different perspectives that wonderfully are woven together here, and woven together even more in the flood story that'll follow in chapter 6 to 9. So let's just jump in by looking first at the right side of our chart. We'll see we're on the final part 3 of chapter 4, the third section where it begins with the man knowing his woman and children emerging from that. While we're on that page, I would just note on the left side in the second column where it says in Genesis 5, 6 to 9, highlighting that the continuity even across the two different authors here, the Yahwist and priestly authors, established these patterns. So whether that was a function of coincidence or of an editor's interweaving these in ways that who knows what they might have left out to make it work this way. We see Adam 14 times in chapters 5 to 6 to 9 and Elohim 7 times, setting up the flood story. So continuing to use things numbers of 7 times. While I'm here on this side of the page, let me bring up this chart, and I'll just make it the big screen. I'm not expecting you to read that, but just to see the big picture of what's going on here. So the red part is chapter 1, in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, and it ends here in chapter 2, verse 4a, and then it starts here in the day that Yahweh, God, made the heavens and the earth when no plant in the field, and we have the Garden of Eden story that continues here through the end of chapter 3, and then we have the Cain story, as you can see here, that we've been looking at through chapter 4. The part that's underlined is what we're looking at today, and as you see, the first part is blue, highlighting that we're in the Yahwist section here, again with the use of Yahweh, but then it switches back to the priestly section here, and we'll continue with that, other than this little insertion here where a Yahweh is mentioned explicitly here, and then it goes back to a Yahwist text here. It's this insertion here that leads many scholars to suggest that certainly if the Yahwist text was older, the priestly author probably wouldn't be inserting a Yahwist phrase in the midst of an otherwise priestly section. So it's suggesting either an editor later took the two independent sources and wove them together by their own criteria that we can't exactly understand, or that the Yahwist text was perhaps later or even simultaneous, perhaps both coming out of exile. So we're going to have to look in the parts that are bolded and underlined here at how they overlap, leaving a couple of clues that the overlap is not as clean as it might be, given that as we just saw, this issue of which parent is naming the child. So I'll pull the note window up a little higher so we can see more of the details of what scholars can provide us here. So Adam, and whether it's Adam or still Adam isn't clear. This is the first use of Adam without the definite article, but it's parallel in in chapter 5 here, whether it's descendants of Adam or the descendants of humankind, as an interesting question. Here in 5:1, humankind in the New RSV is Adam, but here, I'm sorry, it's not there. It's the name of the child, Enosh, here, I'm sorry, there, which also means humankind. So there is another word for humankind. So is this when God created Adam, or is it humankind? It's the exact same word as here, except it's plural. So that's the kind of difference that allows us to hear this as a collective noun here, as opposed to a singular individual male noun there. So going back to where we are in verse 25, Adam knew, again, the yada, the word for sexual knowing. It'll come up in darker ways way later in chapter 19 in the Sodom story. But here, echoing verse 1 of the chapter where Adam knew his wife in the first place. Let's look at that and compare the two so we can see how her response is different. So in chapter 4, verse 1, we hear now the man, in the translation in the New RSV, not saying Adam there. The man knew his wife Eve, exactly reversing what we hear here, where Adam is named and the woman is simply generically his wife or his woman. The man knew his woman Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain here, and she bore a son, noting that there's no mention of conception, saying, I've produced a man with the help of Yahweh. Here, she has the naming, and in 4:1, the produced is a wordplay on the name Cain, just as Seth is a wordplay here on appointed, Shath, as we'll look at in just a moment. But notice the difference in her relationship with the understanding of God's role in this child. In the explicitly Yahweh, in the sense that Yahweh is mentioned in verse 1, we looked at I've produced or I've created or I've made. There's a sense of collaboration going on there, that Eve and Yahweh are co-creators in this producing of a human. But the word is produced or created there, a different word than the word for created, as we'll see in verse 1 of chapter 5, which echoes Genesis 1, a very special Genesis word. So different words here for making or producing highlight different agencies, as we'll see throughout the book. So there, she celebrated her co-creation with God. But here, it's all God's work, she says. The New RSV has appointed, and that's the wordplay, as I just mentioned, shath there. But it doesn't have to mean appointed. The word ordinarily can mean simply put, as it's used in a number of places, like in chapter 3, verse 15, where it said put. That makes for a weird translation in English. God has put for me another child. But there's an ambiguity there the translators have to deal with. And for me, notice that for me, not for us. It's like her child, as if Adam isn't even a part of it. And of course, we haven't seen them talk to each other at all, have we? And it's, although RSV has another child, really, although another is okay, child here is zera for seed, not the usual yeled for child. So God has put for me another seed, and seed, or sometimes as it's translated as offspring, highlighting some perhaps element of the plant sense of what a seed is there. In the Greek, that's sperma, so that resonates for us in English, but zera doesn't correspond for us in a way that resonates in our ears with human fertility as it does with plant fertility in their context. So giving me another seed instead of, and tatath here is an unusual word to be instead. It's usually for under or below. So below Abel or instead of Abel, depending upon how we look at that, because Cain killed him. And in my notes you can see that Genesis Rabbah, the ancient Midrash, reads the verb as passive, hence, he slew Cain. And the quote I have from that, thus interpreting Cain's death as a result of Abel, then the quote from the Midrash, through the sin against Abel, Cain was slain. It was as if two trees were standing near each other, and a wind uprooted one of them, which fell upon the other and uprooted it too. And although that's a fanciful metaphor, as the Midrash often is, it's also a profound statement of the act of violence not only hurts the victim, but it hurts the perpetrator as well. Cain, obviously, the wanderer who's settled in a city, not able to obey God and turned away from God, and his whole lineage will be destroyed in the flood, although Eve obviously doesn't know that here. So she's given up on Cain and accepting of this new child, Seth. And then rather than hear something further about Adam or hear something about Seth's life, immediately we hear the beginning of a genealogy, although it doesn't quite go that way. To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. And we have to stop and pause. Where's the wife? If I scroll back up to what we looked at last time, even a relatively unimportant character like Lamech, not only is he said to have two wives, his wives are named, and they're named as bearing children, and then he addresses them by name here as Ada and Zillah, as we saw last time. But suddenly, with Seth, no wife is named, and there's no sense of companionship at all. It's simply the son bearing another male. And it's a strange name here, humanity or humankind, a collective noun used a number of times, as you can see down there in this section, but in the Pentateuch or Torah, only in Deuteronomy and not again, and other places in Isaiah and the Psalms. But it's a rare thing here, and certainly rare as a proper noun. It's a strange thing that Adam, the human, would name his son humanity. That's what we hear in verse 3. Here it's the living, Eve, not named as such, but the living named her child humanity. Strange thing. But there it is, and of course it represents the future of humankind, because out of this one child, Seth, is going to come everybody else, according to Genesis lineage here. Suddenly an only child away from the line of Cain. So at that time here, and as Westermann notes, the word Oz here means in the primeval period, not specifically in this generation. But it's highlighting something about this period that's setting it in the wider context of the audience, as well as this early primeval history. And it names something strange to us, especially in light of what will follow, not only in the primeval history, but in the call of Abram in chapter 12. We hear at that time people began to invoke the name of Yahweh. Began is a not uncommon word here a few times here. But then you see another interesting comment from the Midrash down below. Then man became degraded to call upon the name of the Lord. And they interpret it as the beginning of rebellion and idol worship. And so if I scroll down in my note a little farther so you can see the full quote there, you can see their impression of it. 4 things changed in the days of Enosh. The mountains became barren rocks. The dead began to feel the worms. Men's faces became ape-like, and they became vulnerable to demons. So they and the rabbis interpret this as part of the general decline, as we already saw as they describe the line of Cain and agriculture as a dead end. Long before Jared Diamond, the rabbis were on that theme. So begin to invoke or call upon the name of Yahweh here, B'Shem Yahweh. And that will be important throughout, both the reality of Yahweh, but the power of the name of Yahweh. It's not said why or how. It's not even a question of which people we're talking about, because, of course, literally in the story, the only people here are Adam, Eve, Seth, and Enosh, and apparently Seth's absent wife, with Cain and his wife elsewhere, and Lamech and their people elsewhere. But they're not invoking Yahweh because Cain turned his back on Yahweh. So this is plainly referring to something that the authors are not worrying about, the literal nature of it. One of countless examples we've seen in these early chapters. We're trying to take this literally, send you up on the rocks of disaster. So then we switch to chapter 5, and I have a lot of notes here on the chapter here, and noting, and I'm just going to note some of those there. I'm going to look at those next time, just to note they're here, because I'm going to focus on the genealogy and the structure of it next time. So here, I just want to focus on these verses and what we were looking at and how things echo. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. In Hebrew, the Sefer Toledot, the book of the genealogy. Toledot, we saw in chapter 2, verse 4 earlier, the Toledot of the heavens and the earth, as a conclusion of the priestly version of creation, suggesting that the naming we saw in the sequence in chapter 1 is like a sequence of generations, like with humans here. But it's the only time we hear in Genesis the word Sefer for book. As you can see in my note in the Septuagint, it's translated Biblios Genesios Anthropon, which matches virtually identically the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, only substituting Jesu Christou for Anthropon. So Matthew starting his book with an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah according to the New Revised Standard, sadly not allowing us to see the parallel in their same translation, that is the book of the Genesis of Jesus the Messiah. So Matthew clearly taking this from Genesis 5:1. And then there's something interesting for both Genesis and Matthew that you see there, because if it's a list of the descendants of Adam or of humanity, then what Matthew's doing is substituting Jesus Christ for Adam, and of course that would fit very well with the Pauline theology of Jesus as the new Adam. So just a nice little connection across Genesis 5 to Matthew's Gospel that hidden behind the Septuagint, not obviously in the Hebrew, because Matthew, as far as we know, never wrote that in Hebrew. So we're going to see the Sefer Toledot, the book of the genealogy of Adam. And yet before we do that, we see this repetition that calls us back to the first chapter here. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. And so it's recalling a past event, a rare thing we've seen so far. There's not a lot of past yet. The word for created here, bero, is a special word. We saw it in chapter 1. It's 3 times in just this verse and the next verse. But it's very different than the word for made that we see also in this verse. So when God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. And we'll see that many times, this combination of, in this section here, of created and made. But made is the very common word asa, which is used many, many times. Humans can make things and God makes things. But created is uniquely for what God does here. It'll only happen one more time, and that's in chapter 6, verse 7. And that will be the undoing of this creation, when God regrets having made humankind. So when God created humankind, here again as Adam, he made them in the likeness of God, but it doesn't see the image and likeness, as we saw earlier. Just bidmuth here, not selim, as you can see in my note. And also echoing the male and female that we saw in chapter 1, verse 27. It's a strange thing, because if we look at my chart back here, and we look at the whole picture, and we try to understand how this would follow if we went just back to the end of the P part here, it would end here. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, and then it would continue here. When God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God. But why would one need that summary unless one was jumping back into one's own voice after having been interrupted by another voice? In other words, without the intervention of chapters 2, 3, and 4, why would the priestly author need to remind people of what had just been heard a few verses earlier if we're reading the P narrative straight through? So it's really suggesting something that source-oriented scholars, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not an expert on that, as far as I know, haven't grappled with much, which is maybe the P and the J authors collaborated in the editing of this. Maybe they weren't done by somebody else later. Maybe they just sat down together and worked it out. And we'll see maybe how that plays out also in the flood story. So, reminding that male and female he created them and blessed them and named them. So just as the woman had named Seth, and we'll see the man named Seth, here also God does some naming here, and literally and calling their name humankind here as Adam when they were created. So creating a little symmetry here in verse 2. So after that summary, now it moves into new events, and it's the first time we're going to see ages listed here. As von Wolde notes about what's happening here, what is handed on in the fathering is given an ultimate value. It is the likeness with God which continues in history. There is a likeness, but as we're going to see, it's a copy of a copy. Is that like a Xerox of a Xerox, or the copy diminishes over time, or is it an exact copy? We don't have to invoke genetics to ask that question, because we know that it's never an exact copy. The child never looks exactly like the parent, but what does that say about the image or likeness of God in them? I'm going to skip over some of the number issues now, because we're going to use the great Umberto Cassuto, the late Italian Jewish biblical scholar, next time to explore the numbers throughout the chapter. But I'll highlight now, as I've said before, all biblical numbers are symbolic. They are not counting devices. They're all used like words to say something. And so we'll see how Umberto, more than anybody else I'm aware of, has unraveled the mystery of these great ages here as little number puzzles on the Babylonian base 60 number system. And we'll see that next time. So when Adam lived 130 years, he became the father of a son in his likeness. Notice, not their likeness, just in his likeness. And where is Eve in this version? We haven't seen Eve mentioned in the priestly version because Eve was all part of the Garden of Eden story. But we hadn't seen Adam in the priestly story either. We just saw human beings made. We had not seen individuals. Adam had been a function simply of the Garden of Eden's creation story, another element of where perhaps the writers were working together. So he became a father of a son in his likeness and according to his image. So if we put these things together, we see that it said when God created humankind, he made them in the likeness of God, and now the first human made is making a son in his likeness and according to his image, but not according to God's image. And that's the question of the copy of a copy. What would it mean to carry the likeness of God, but the image of one's parent? And perhaps that's just the nature of how it goes, that now that we're in the ongoing generations have been created by humans rather than directly by God, we carry both the likeness of God but also the image of our parents with us. And he named him Seth, but there's no wordplay, and P doesn't tend to do that kind of thing as J does. So we come near the end of our section here with the numbering of the full days of Adam as after he became the father of Seth, 800 years. We'll see that same kind of division in the Abraham lifetime, where there's a period of time before they move out of the land, a period of time in the land, and then a period of time after he becomes the father to Isaac, set out in a configured schematic sort of way, as we'll see. Other sons and daughters. First time we're hearing about daughters. There had to be daughters, or Cain wouldn't have had a wife, and neither would Seth have had children. But we hadn't heard of any females at all other than Eve so far. And 9 times in this Toledot series, we will hear of daughters. It's not like the authors didn't understand that the 2 partners are necessary to make a child. And so we come to the conclusion today with verse 5, that all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. The first natural death. We don't hear about Eve's death here, but the first natural death. And if we were to play that out as Casuta does, and we'll look at this next time, all the generations are alive here at the same time. 930 years is plenty of time to cover everything that we've seen so far. So the simultaneity ends here with the natural death of Adam after this schematic period of 930 years. So we'll pick up there with the rest of the genealogy next time, and we'll explore how Casuto unravels this fabulous mystery of the numbers being number plays on the Babylonian base 60 number system. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.